Your Humanities Half Hour is brought to you by the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.
Hafidades and Tiro, welcome to Your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Harris, and today we're looking at the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday tomorrow, and we thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about some civil rights issues here in the Northern Mariana Islands. And for the first half of our show, it's my pleasure to have back in studio the Northern Marianas Protection and Advocacy Services, specifically their Executive Director Jim Rayphand and Projects Specialist Greg Borja. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks for having us.
Well, NM Posse, it's a very familiar word to many people, but they may not actually understand what your job entails or what the role of the office is. Share with us a little bit.
Well, NM Posse is a part of a nationwide network of disability rights advocacy groups. We basically protect the legal rights of people with disabilities through advocacy, which is legal representation, help, or support. And here in the CNMI, we function under 7 different programs, each targeted to a different population of people that have disabilities.
Wow. You just summarized a whole lot of work in like 20 seconds. So what are some of these services that you provide?
Well, what we look at is using laws that protect the rights of people with disabilities. For one, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which basically draws a framework from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where we look at protections for people with disabilities when it comes to areas like employment, access to our government's programs and services, and also to access to private entities that provide public accommodations. And so what we look at is that people with disabilities are actually a large population in the United States. We make up about 5% of the total population. So there's a large number of people with disabilities. And so at times, because of our physical disabilities, for example, we might encounter barriers like architectural barriers when it comes to like getting access to a business or an establishment. Like there's stairs and I can't use my wheelchair to get up those stairs. That's a problem. So what NM Posse would do is we negotiate, is one of our services, with those business owners to try to eliminate those barriers for people, because everybody should have the right to go in and use the services, use the businesses we have here around the island without being discriminated against, because of our disabilities.
Now, is it, say the business is not accessible, maybe it's not easy for somebody in a wheelchair, for example, to get into the business. Is that in itself already a violation of the law?
In fact, it pretty much is, because if you provide a service to our community, that service should be available to everyone in our community, including people with disabilities. People with disabilities, we have money, we want to spend it in your store, and if you impose a barrier on us to prevent us from going into your store, you're not only losing out on our business, but we have friends that maybe they're not going to go to your business either. Sorry.
And a little more specifically, Catherine, where it would be a direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, mm-hmm. which specifies accessibility guidelines and things like that. So yes, if your business is not in compliance with the ADA, then we would say it is a violation.
So when it comes to actual physical accessibility, or maybe it's not just physical, maybe there's other ways that people need to access services that's not necessarily going into the building. What are some of the common shortfalls you see here in the Commonwealth that we should be aware of?
Okay, well, just to touch on sort of the non-physical or the facility access issue, there's attitudinal barriers, right? I mean, I think one of the easiest things that we see is employers assuming that a person with disability can't do something. I think that's ultimately a very common thing. Somebody sees somebody in a wheelchair and they automatically think, oh, this person is not going to be able to do the job, or this person is going to be too costly to hire, it's going to take too much work. So I think that you mentioned the non-facility type of barriers, and that is certainly one of them.
Yeah, other ones may include effective communication. If I'm a person who's deaf or cannot speak, you still need to be able to communicate with me somehow, so that I can have access to your services. Again, it's not a physical barrier, but again, just being able to communicate and speak with somebody to find out what they want and how you get it for them, that's another barrier that we see that's kind of common as well.
What are some that you have successfully helped businesses resolve, or maybe it was a government office? Like, for example, what is your most frequent violation that you guys have helped to overcome?
Go ahead.
Well, our most frequent violation, honestly, and we're still working on it, is accessible parking, the blue spaces that we see in front of most businesses.
And they come in all shapes and sizes here in the CNMI, it seems like.
That's very true. And there's actually a set of standards put forth not only by the Americans with Disabilities Act, but we have local laws, too, of how big that space should be, what color it's supposed to be, if they're supposed to have a sign in front of it, because we want to ensure that people who need the spot, are parking there by use of a placard. But we do have people that like to just roll in because it's the closest spot to the store. Maybe I'm feeling a little lazy, it's raining too much, and I decide to park in it, or not even park in it, but block the space. So those are some violations that our office, along with the Attorney General's office, Department of Public Safety, we're trying to work together not only to stop people from violating and parking those spots, but to create awareness, that if those spaces aren't meant for you, then please find somewhere else to go.
And so that may be the most frequent. I mean, that's the one we see. As soon as you get to the place, you see that. And then there's also issues with employers refusing to provide reasonable accommodations, or putting responsibilities on a person with a disability that is not necessarily part of the essential functions of the job they were hired to do. And that's a key point, that people with disabilities still have to be qualified to do the jobs, but that they are held only to the standard of performing the essential functions of the job, and not other things that are sort of irrelevant that could pose a barrier for them in the workplace.
So when you talk about reasonable accommodation, can you give us a few examples of what would be reasonable accommodation, and what would be an accommodation that you wouldn't require an employer to make?
I think, in fairness, it's all on a case-to-case basis, and there's different types of reasonable accommodations for different disabilities, let's say. Some of the things, just as quick examples that come to mind, someone's, let's say, with a back issue that's working in a factory or something, and these were actual cases that maybe we've dealt with, just allowing the person to sit as opposed to standing all day. For instance, that doesn't affect the essential function of them delivering the goods or whatever, packaging the goods, but allowing them to sit, that could be one form. For some folks with anxiety and mental health disorders, it could be things as simple as giving them more frequent breaks. I mean, still having them make up their time, the total hours, but allowing them extra time, or time to kind of de-escalate, I guess it is, when they need it. And those are a couple examples. Maybe Greg has more.
Well, one example as a reasonable accommodation is if, for example, I'm someone that needs dialysis twice a week, and so my employer might be able to let me off during those hours that I need it, but I still have to go in, kind of like Jim said, and complete my 8 hours for the day. So maybe I can have a flexible schedule where I work, instead of 8 to 5, I can extend my time to 6 or whatever, just so I can make those hours, but again, I'm still performing my job and I'm getting my treatment at the same time.
And it really kind of wraps back around to that notion of essential functions of the job. I mean, the employers aren't expected to stop business for these accommodations, but if they can be accommodated without disrupting the normal flow of their work or their business, then it's reasonable to ask that, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you guys would have information on this, but with more employers needing U.S. eligible workers, are you seeing more employers extending this reasonable accommodation to bring these people into the workforce?
I'm not sure if there's an increase per se, but there certainly are some employers out there willing to do it, and they're certainly looking to do it. And it's also sometimes a matter of just accessing the resources or the information. And in this case, for employment reasons, we always refer folks who in need of reasonable accommodations or help at work to the OVR office, the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, which is actually mandated to try to provide support for people to either obtain or maintain employment. So yeah, I'm not sure that there's an increase linked to this need for more U.S. workers, but we certainly
Maybe it's
see
more
employers trying.
awareness or good enforcement by you guys.
Sure. Well, we hope.
Yeah, one video that we've seen of about a company in the United States, on the mainland, what they did was they actually put forth accommodations to help people with disabilities want to come into work more. So instead of using like a computer with a keypad and whatnot, it's just all touch screen. It's a little bit more simpler. And what they noticed is that even the people with disabilities, they were happy to come to work every day, and so they were there every day with a smile, and they saw the performance of their non-disabled workers also increase as well. So it's a benefit to all involved, when we just get everyone involved working.
And for what it's worth, that could be a form of reasonable accommodations also. Instead of having somebody having to use a keyboard, per se, for computer-related work, they created touch screen programs to allow folks with those kinds of limitations to be able to more easily do the work.
Greg, you were giving the example of the biggest problem being not having accessible parking. And so... And I'm thinking about, it's really, in a way, speaking from a cultural perspective, it's kind of like about respect. Or there's a word we have in Carolinian called afaye, which means to have compassion on. And when you think about, the individual who's going to use that parking space, you would have a feeling of compassion for them to make it equally available to them to use the facility or whatever. Are there any cultural challenges you feel, or is there a sense of community support maybe for these types of accommodations?
Well, with the parking, one of my own personal observations is that maybe I'm driving my grandma around, and so she's got the accessible placard in her car, so I'm allowed to park in the space, but then I'm the one that gets out, I'm the one that goes in the store, I use the accessible line at the store. To me, that's really not needed for me. Just because I'm there for my grandma, if she was the one getting out of the car, then she's the one that needs that closeness of the space. She's the one that needs that accommodation in line. So I think that there's also, we're trying to help each other, but sometimes we take it for granted, and whatever's good for my grandma is good for me. But we kind of need to look away from that, where if I'm able to go in and do it, maybe I should park in a different spot so that someone that's actually driving themselves that has more of a need should get it out, get out and do it. So if I notice someone that does have a need, like they have the placard in their cars, they're pulling up, I'll make sure that I'm not in that spot, or I'll let them come in front of line, if they seem to have more of a need to get through a line something quicker because they're having difficulty carrying their items or whatnot. So culturally, I believe there are a lot of people on island that do that, and it's positive for all of us, again, just to help each other.
And it surprises me. I'm glad you touched on the point about culture. It surprises me that more people aren't more sensitive to the need for those parking spaces, employers and drivers alike. I mean, ultimately, in most cases, it's going to be our manamco who need it. I mean, what's more important to us than our manamco, right?
Good point.
They're the ones who oftentimes need that access. As far as other cultural attitudes, and we certainly don't want to fault people for being overly cautious or overly caring to people with disabilities, but I think one of the barriers sometimes is people let's use the word pity, like feeling pity for people with disabilities, and kind of over protecting them and over doing everything for them, as opposed to encouraging them to step out and become more independent and that really is more along the line of work that we do. We are ultimately trying to break down barriers so that individuals with disabilities are more independent and can do things for themselves and make their own decisions, make informed decisions, as opposed to everybody spoon-feeding them and carrying them everywhere. Mm-hmm. So, again, it's a cultural thing that you love because we care for our people with disabilities, there's no question. But I think that sometimes is a hindrance.
Or it needs to be balanced with the need for their
it needs to be balanced. I mean, all of us. I mean, ultimately, what we want out of our kids and out of people in general is to be independent and self-informed and self-aware, and we don't do that by, overprotecting people and keeping them inside the houses and saying you can't go out because you're going to get hurt, right? And we've had cases like that. Believe it or not.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, right. And we've had some unfortunate cases where we've had to take really strong stance on people that want to be outside and want to be free to walk around, and we've had to take their side. And the question is always about safety. Well, is it, it's not safe for them to be walking along the side of the road. Well, but it's their choice to walk along the side of the road. I mean, and we all have that choice to do that. I mean, people with disabilities have the same choice. And so sometimes that's where our role gets a little bit cloudy, and people sometimes don't like us for that, because we are ultimately going for the person's choice of what they want to do.
So, Jim, what's our takeaway today for our listeners? What would you like them to bottom line understand or think or do with this information that we've shared with them today?
Yeah, if anything else, I think very simply is you can't assume that people with disabilities are not able to do stuff. I mean, that's the most important thing. We got to assume on the right side of things, assume that they can, and let's help them to achieve whatever that is. I'm sure there's more
Greg,
more
any
profound
final
thoughts than that.
Well, my final thought is the word stigma. A lot of times people with disabilities are attached with that word stigma, which is a fear. There's no need to be afraid of people with disabilities. And if you're a person with disabilities, don't be afraid to go out and get help if you need it. Because, again, there's a stigma attached to some of the services provided. So the main thing is that there are services and programs out there for everybody, and please avail of them as you're able to.
So I think that's important, but awareness is key. I mean, and it's important. I think, if nothing else, at least know that an Emposse is there as a resource to give information and to offer some legal protection if needed, or just lay advocacy protection if needed. And our doors are always open. Okay.
Well, we've been speaking today with Jim Rayphand, Executive Director, and Greg Borja, Project Specialist of an Emposse, Northern Marianas Protection and Advocacy Services, Inc. Gentlemen, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Appreciate this opportunity.
Day, this is Eulalia Villagomez of the Northern Marianas Humanities Council. Did you know that you can donate up to $5,000 to the Humanities Council through the CNMI Education Tax Credit Program? Donations from individuals and corporations qualify and can be used to offset your local wage and salary tax, BGRT, and earnings tax. Call our office at 235-4785 to see how you can support humanities programs in our community and obtain a tax credit for your donation. Thank you, and Jesus Masi.
Welcome back to Your Humanities Half Hour during our special today with Martin Luther King Jr. Day coming up tomorrow. We're looking at civil rights from various angles. And in this half of the show, it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Mr. John Davis, longtime Saipan resident and the plaintiff in the recent case Davis versus Commonwealth Election Commission, as well as his legal counsel, Gene Rayphand. Gene, welcome to Your Humanities Half Hour.
Well, thank you for having us.
Now, John, you've been here in Saipan a long time. Mm-hmm. You're practically from Saipan at this point. Tell us a little bit about how you first got here.
Well, I came to the Marianas in 1986, before it was actually the Commonwealth. I came here to assist in opening the Commonwealth Health Center. After we did that, I went back to the States for a year, and it got cold. I came back. And I've been back here ever since.
When you compare the hot and the cold of here in the States, you're like, Saipan has some appeal.
Yes, it does, right? Tropics, and it's warm, and the people are friendly for the most part. We are really, truly a diverse community. I like that.
A lot of people obviously know you for the many roles you've played here in the Commonwealth, and perhaps most recently, if not most importantly, is the recent decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit regarding the case that qualified voters who are not of Northern Marianas descent must have the opportunity to vote on Article 12 initiative and any other initiatives related or to amend Article 12. And Article 12, of course, is the land alienation case. What was it that prompted you to file this case?
Okay, I grew up in the United States in the 50s and 60s, and we fought long and hard for the right to vote in the United States, for everyone to have the right to vote. And I just thought it was wrong that I should move out into an island which is otherwise so diverse and so friendly, so worldly. We have so much going on here. Then to come here and be told, oh, you can't vote. That's just wrong, right? I believe that at the time that's my constitutional right. It's I forget the word, but an inherent right, the ones that we don't have to justify, right? We live in a democracy, we vote. So I filed the case.
When you filed the case, what did you feel your chances were? Did you feel you had a good chance of winning, or did you feel like, win or lose, I feel I need to do this?
Well, there was no losing. As I said, right, this kind of case has been settled, not once, not twice, many times, okay? It's in the Constitution repeatedly, every time a different group, whether it's gender, ethnicity, race, disabilities, whatever, right? It's in the Constitution in the various amendments that the right to vote will not be infringed upon. So everybody that I talk to talks about this as if it's about Article 12. I'm going to say for the first time out here in public, I'm in favor of Article 12. Right? I believe that Article 12 and its purpose is something that we need here so that the indigenous people can maintain some sort of land ownership here. However, the local persons or the indigenous people need and rights to their ethnicity, their culture, their traditions, and their land doesn't infringe upon my right to vote. And I believe that if you infringe on my right to vote about one thing, the next time something comes up, it'll be much more easy to say, we don't want you to vote on that either. And pretty soon, or after a while, I'm not allowed to vote on anything because I'm not from the Marianas Islands. And as long as the U.S. flag flies here, I'm going to keep my right to vote. To answer your question, though, excuse me. To answer your question, though, this was a no-brainer. We knew we were going to win. We knew that the Ninth Circuit Court was going to uphold that. We just knew that because it's a constitutional issue and it's written in black and white in the Constitution. So there wasn't a matter of how do we feel about it. What I didn't understand is why they would appeal. Why they would appeal the case. These are lawyers. They knew better. But
Jean, share with us a little bit about the process of when the case was filed and how it got to the Ninth Circuit.
We first filed a case back in 2012, and it got dismissed because there was no issue on the ballot at that time. So once the issue of an amendment to Article 12 got on the ballot, we filed a case again. We moved for summary judgment, prevailed. The other side appealed. NMDs came in as amicus on the appeal, and we argued, and the court made its decision.
Now, I've heard mention in the past, and obviously the court feels otherwise with their decision, but I believe it was maybe some covenant negotiators who were sharing their story about how they came up with the definition of Northern Marianas descent. And their understanding at that time was that it was a political definition versus a racial definition or ethnicity definition. Did that argument at all, because there were people who were declared Northern Marianas descent, although they were not Chamorro and Carolinians, I believe, they fit the definition. Was this discussed at all as part of the case?
They argued that it was a political definition, but I think it clearly was not. They made a very careful decision to eliminate everyone else except Carolinian and Chamorro, although a few people slipped in. But it was clearly racial, I think. And the court, as you noticed, they said ancestry is a racial definition, so that's what this is all about.
And just for the record, as a person who deals in the English language, okay, race, the concept of race is a political definition. So it's like those two things, while the lawyers like to separate them out, they are connected like peas in a pod, right? There is no scientific thing called race, right? Race is politics. But because of the law, you can't separate it out and to say, okay, that's we're talking about politics, and that guy over there is talking race, because it doesn't work that way. If there was no need to separate people into separate groups, right? Politicians wouldn't have came up with the word race.
Why do you think it took so long, or has taken so long, for this issue to come before the court in this format?
I think it's because it had to go on the ballot first.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Before there was a real controversy.
I see. So how do you feel about the final decision by the Ninth Circuit, John?
Well, I think they're smart.
Obviously.
I think they can read. I think that they understand what the Constitution is and how it works. I mean, these are judges, and they're constitutional scholars. That's all they do all day, right? Mm-hmm. That and play golf. But this is what they do. So I had I believed in that this was going to be the outcome. I think that it was the just thing to do. I think that in the future, that even those people who presently probably hate my guts, that in the future that they'll appreciate this idea that as an American, we all have a right to always have our voices heard through the ballot.
You mentioned at the beginning of our talk about your experience during the civil rights movement in the United States. Mm-hmm. Could you share with us, like, what are perhaps some of the feelings or the memories you had that kind of propelled you to file this case and to see it through?
I'm 69 years old, okay? Young people back then, right? We wanted just the right to be like everyone else, okay, in the United States. I didn't know what a chamorro was, never heard the word. Didn't if somebody came to me and said, Rafalawash, what's that, you know? I didn't know about these things. I was concerned about my people back then. I was a junior member of the Congress on Racial Equality. And I stood on the street corners and passed out pamphlets, right, for our basic civil rights, to be civil. As I heard a comedian say, how basic is that to have civil rights, just equal rights, right? And one of those rights was the right to vote, right, to go to school where I wanted to go, to pretty much say where I wanted to go to church where I wanted to go, to eat where I wanted to eat, to drink water where I wanted to drink water, to sit in the movie theater. There was a lot of things going on back in those days. People tend to forget. When I was involved in these movements until I joined the Army, right? But even in the military, there was a certain amount of discrimination, right? In the United States, it wasn't that so much overseas, but in the United States, it was there were racial and problems. But when I joined the Army, I then found out that black people aren't the only ones, right? There were people there were Hispanics, there were Asians, I met my first Inuit in the military, right? So I got a bigger worldview and saw that, okay, it's not as bad as I grew up thinking it was going to be, or that it was, right? And that stuck with me my entire life, that I've seen all this diversity. I love Saipan because I love it because of the warm weather, but the big thing is the diversity here, right? You can sit down and talk to Chinese, Koreans, Filipinos, Bangladeshis, excuse me, Rafalawash, Chamorros, wherever, right? Rednecks, blue necks, everything, right? And nobody gets really out of the way about it, okay? So I carry that always, right? Because I remember the old days. So back to the case, when I heard this, I'm like, oh no, we're not going backwards. Right, we just can't have that. And the first step to going backwards is saying you don't have a voice, and our voice is our vote. So my upbringing, my experiences in the service, and my travels these all impacted on how I feel about this. Can't impinge on my right to vote, and you can't impinge on my right to speak. We're good after that.
Well, I think that's a great summary. Jean, any final thoughts from your end before we go?
Nothing, thank you.
Well, I thank you both for making time to share this story with us today, and wish you a very happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Thank you.
We've been speaking today with John Davis and Jean Rayphand regarding the case Davis versus Commonwealth Election Commission. This has been your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Harris.
This program was supported by a We the People grant awarded to the Northern Marianas Humanities Council from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.